David, nice to be with you.
Likewise, and he's got a new book out. It's called Managers, Can You Hear Me Now? And it's got a bunch of management guidance. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And after the thing today, Mr. Strigl will be here to sign copies. So buy a copy, sign the book. There it is. First, it might be a little more interesting from a headline point of view to talk a little bit about the telecom industry and some of the things that we've seen in the news lately before we delve into the meat and potatoes of Mr. Strigl's book. Probably the biggest headline that has been out lately is AT&T making a run at T-Mobile, consolidating the wireless side. Verizon has said, oh, we're not interested in Sprint Nextel. Yeah, right. So it looks like Ma Bell is putting herself back together. No?
David, I find the book much more interesting to talk about.
Thought you might.
I think that AT&T has made the right move for AT&T. I think that if AT&T didn't strongly believe that they couldn't do this deal from a regulatory approval point of view, they wouldn't have done it. I think it probably is, as AT&T professes, I think it's good in particular for rural communities. I think it's good overall for AT&T because it gives them more spectrum. They have had issues with their service, particularly in some of the major cities, which they've worked hard to correct over the last few years, but I do think it puts them in a strong position to support a lot of the media-based type phones that you see today.
And this is good for consumers how?
I think it's good for consumers in that it certainly makes the industry from a Verizon AT&T point of view no less competitive. I'm not sure that it helps individual consumers. I think it probably leaves them as they are today. And I think, given the competition in the industry, I think you've seen prices come down of cellular service. I think you'll continue to see that.
And yet it seems as though we're heading towards a virtual duopoly when it comes to wireless service, AT&T versus Verizon, not necessarily competing with each other in the same territories and basically carving out their little bits.
Well, to the contrary. First of all, let me tell you, I am a retired executive of Verizon. I did spend 20 years with AT&T. I have no axe to grind with either company. Okay, but I think it is incorrect to think that each are building their own little monopolies, if you will, within individual markets. In virtually every market across the United States, they are fierce competitors. But in addition to AT&T and Verizon, of course, we have Sprint, we have startup companies, Metro PCS, for example, all bring a different product line, if you will, and different prices into the marketplace. I think it continues to be a very competitive market.
And yet both Sprint and Metro PCS have been cited as takeover targets, probably by Verizon.
I don't have any comment on that. They have been takeover targets that I remember for probably the last 20 years. As have many others by AT&T, Verizon, or, call it what you will. Today, excuse me, David, but today in telecommunications, like in many other industries, everybody's a takeover target.
I saw that there was another round of legislation that's been introduced in Washington for what's known as bill shock. Bill shock is when you get your wireless bill and it is through the roof, typically after you've gone traveling overseas, roaming charges have kicked in, and it's like, wait a minute, where did that come from? It happens a lot. I get a lot of complaints from people about bill shock. The wireless companies routinely say, gosh, we do our very best to educate people, and yet you would think that if they did, or if those outreach efforts were sufficient, we wouldn't have bill shock. Yet the FCC says millions of people succumb to this every single year, and now there is another bill being introduced to address this sort of thing. How serious is bill shock, and do the wireless companies do enough to protect their customers from these sky-high bills?
This has become more a political issue than it has an issue in reality. My guess is that over the years since wireless service was introduced, that from at one time or another, people have looked at their bill and they've been surprised. By the way, I have no doubt about that. There have been times, particularly early in the industry, when people were billed per minute. In California, incidentally, I also remember the days when people were billed for busy signals. You actually paid for that when people didn't answer their phone. So some of that in history was really what I would call bill shock. I think that the number of people who are shocked by their bills today, with the millions and millions of people that have wireless service in the United States, is small potatoes. Should they be shocked? No, they shouldn't. But by the way, the carriers, through legal requirements and also through their own explanations, not forced by the FCC or the Public Service Commissions, do a very decent job in explaining to their customers what they should expect in their bills. In addition, there are companies who will retroactively fix the bill if an issue has arisen. Will they do it every month? No. But they work very hard to educate their customers. After all, the purpose of a wireless carrier is to keep the customers that they have. They don't want to lose them. So I think that, in my opinion, as a retired Verizon executive, I think this proposed rulemaking is an overreach.
Does it surprise you that Verizon took as long as it did to bring the iPhone onto the network?
No. Why?
Good try, though.
Okay, well, thank you for finally getting at least a little bit into the book.
We're sort of creeping up on it.
It doesn't surprise me at all. And as I have written in the book, a little bit of history. Many years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, Steve Jobs came to Verizon with a proposal that we were very interested in, and it was for what became the iPhone. We talked about it, I would say, on probably 3 or 4 different occasions.
Let me interrupt for a second. What did you make of this idea? I mean, we all know what the iPhone is now, but at the time, it must have seemed extraordinary.
Oh, fascinating. By the way, it wasn't in the early design phase what you actually see today. So, to be fair, the product itself, as you know, has evolved over time. But the early ideas that Apple and that Steve had about the iPhone were very intriguing to me and to others at Verizon. As time went on and the product became more a reality, from the drawing board to an actual product, negotiations went on about who would carry the iPhone. The logical conclusion that Apple drew, by the way, I agree with where they went with this, was they chose to go with a worldwide wireless standard called GSM. GSM is a standard used essentially around the world. There are places in the Far East, for example, that use another called CDMA. CDMA is the standard that Verizon uses. But the proliferation of phones around the world were GSM. The logical move for AT&T to make was to create a bigger market for the iPhone, and therefore to introduce a GSM phone. The largest GSM carrier in the United States, AT&T. So Apple logically did a deal, not with Verizon and the CDMA technology, but with AT&T and GSM technology.
I've spoken with some analysts who've said this was an incredibly shrewd decision on Verizon's part, because nobody really knew the stresses this would place on the wireless network, the data that comes into a smartphone of this caliber. You guys stepped back. AT&T got its you-know-what kicked because their network couldn't handle much of this. There was a lot of complaints about it, and now you guys can step in and look like the White Knight.
Well, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to react to that. I don't entirely agree that we meant it at Verizon as a shrewd strategy. We would love to have had the iPhone. Fact of the matter is that it didn't happen. In fact, never did we get to a point with Apple where we even talked about actual terms and conditions of Verizon carrying the iPhone. Not one piece of paper was exchanged. Apple did a deal with the largest possible carrier that they could around the world, GSM service. So shrewd, thank you. Did it destroy AT&T's service? I don't think so. I mean, there was a lot of, obviously, bad press, bad vibes, improvements in the network services that were required. But overall, I think that AT&T has benefited from carrying the Apple iPhone. It hasn't hurt them, perhaps from a service perception point of view, which, if there's a shrewd thing that we did at Verizon, it was what business people would do: take advantage of what we saw as a pitfall, and that was that service was deteriorating in some places. Not a long-term issue for AT&T.
I promise you we're going to get into the book in just a moment. It's going to happen. One more thing about the iPhone, though, because the issues it raises are very important, and that is the iPhone raised the bar for smartphones. And now we have all of the Android phones that are coming out, and BlackBerry is bringing out its new tablet, and there's a whole new generation, clearly, of very, very smart devices that are very, very bandwidth heavy. Do we have the wireless infrastructure that we need to handle these new generations of devices?
The wireless infrastructure, in very simple terms, I'd define it, David, two ways. The number of cell sites or towers across the U.S. and the amount of spectrum to put on those towers to carry the bandwidth that's required. There's always a need for more cell sites in various places across the U.S., particularly in some of the rural communities. But the spectrum is there. There's no question in my mind that there is enough spectrum. And the challenge for carriers is to engineer it properly, that it is, wrong word, but you get the point, ubiquitous wireless radio waves within communities that are using these high-tech devices.
One nation under Wi-Fi.
Well, incidentally, Wi-Fi helps. As I think about it, this morning I was on my iPad and using Wi-Fi in the hotel. And as I leave the hotel, of course, I'm over wireless service, over cellular service. So sure, Wi-Fi, particularly in what we might call hotspots or in poorly served cellular areas, is very helpful. And I think those two technologies, Wi-Fi and GSM or CDMA, blend very nicely together.
Turns out you have a book. Here it is, finally coming into view. The core of the book are the four fundamentals. Tell us about the four fundamentals.
When you think about what managers do every day, let me back up if I may. Why I wrote this book was because when you think about it as managers, what you learn, I'll be careful here, not necessarily at the Drucker School, but what you learn in colleges, universities, and in management seminars, by and large, really, those things don't work. They're nice, but when it actually comes to managing in a competitive environment, they really are only a beginning. They don't work. They're not the end all. So what I wanted to do was to, if I may be so bold as to say, help managers by focusing on things that make a difference in getting results. So, David, the theme of the book is a manager's job is to get real results. And in the book, I attempt to define what I mean by real results. But there are four things, there are four fundamentals that managers must do to be successful. And they have to do one or more of these four fundamentals. It needs to be their key focus. This will sound obvious, but it's not. Grow revenue, get new customers, keep the customers that you have, and work to cut your costs. And what I suggest is that if you're not focused totally on one or more of those four things, you are focused on the wrong things, and you need to stop doing those things, rejigger your priorities, and do one or more of those four things.
Give us an example of how a manager might err by not focusing on these. Where might a manager focus instead that would be a misstep?
Well, here is the obvious, and my guess is it applies to every one of us in this room, certainly myself included. The biggest management distraction today is email.
And meetings.
Right? Well, but yes, and if I may, I'll come to that. But when you think about it, many managers today start the day in their office, stay in their office, end the day in their office, and what they are doing, for the most part, is responding to or sending new emails. And I would challenge anyone to look at their, whatever you want to call it, their position guide, the job that they were hired to do. And I've never heard a manager say, my job is to send and receive emails. Right? I mean, go back to the four fundamentals. Those are the things that you get paid to do.
But how does the four fundamentals get you out of that trap? I mean, communication is a part of management.
Because what you do in email, I'll give you this, that some of the things you do in email really does focus on one or more of those four fundamentals, but most of the things do not. Most of the email that you receive, if you're anything like me, they're things that don't require an answer. Or they are things that someone is sending you a copy of somebody else's email that they think you should read. Most of that is, emails to cover their own butts, if you will. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. So the key ingredient, if you will, or tool that a manager should use to attack those four fundamentals is to get out of their office, meet with their employees and their customers face to face, to look at what employees are doing to get their job done, to find out what pitfalls they are encountering, what obstacles they have, how the manager might help to resolve those issues, look for opportunities that present themselves in the course of the day that the real frontline people in a company are facing, and that's where managers should be spending their time. In addition to that, I have never learned more in my career than I did talking to customers. Now, some of talking to customers is, listening to things that you think, well, I really didn't need to hear that. But the majority of what you hear from customers are things that you can use to shape the business to do three things: keep the customers you have, get new customers, and grow revenue.
But you make it sound easy that a manager can disengage and do this sort of field work, whether it's schmoozing with subordinates or going out and talking to customers and whatnot. Virtually every manager I know, especially senior level managers, are so time constrained that they just can't block out the time for this sort of, amorphous sort of gatherings.
Well, with all due respect, I think that's baloney. I was a senior manager for years. And I was not so busy that I couldn't meet with my people and meet with my customers because, in my opinion, there is nothing more important. Okay, so to your earlier point, David, what many people perceive as a manager's job, particularly an executive, a senior manager, is that they attend meetings. I found that most meetings were a complete waste of time.
Amen.
And I do spend the majority of a chapter in the book talking about how a meeting should be run, whether you should attend a meeting or not. And the key to me is, I'll go right back to the four fundamentals. If a meeting isn't targeted on one or more of those four fundamentals, you have to ask yourself, why should I go? And to my experience, most meetings I attended started in the middle, worked its way to the beginning, and ended up at the end. And at the end of the meeting, I typically ask myself, why was I here? And what did I get out of this meeting? So in my business, my way of managing was to make sure that people from the very beginning said, here's the beginning time of the meeting, here's the ending time of the meeting. How many meetings have you been to that have run on and on and on and on? It's discourteous, but here's the beginning, here's the end, and during this meeting, here's what we will accomplish. At the end of every meeting I attended, I would ask, are there any questions? Have we accomplished what we set out to accomplish in this meeting? And meetings generally were 30 to 60 minutes long.
Great if you're the boss. Most managers don't have that luxury. They have to go to meetings, and it's basically a matter of FaceTime.
No, they don't. No, they don't. A lot of managers go to meetings because they think it's a good thing to do. And I used to tell my people that if you think you shouldn't be at a meeting, don't go. Don't go. And if the majority of people invited to a meeting didn't show up to a meeting, the people who called the meeting would really wonder, what am I missing here? I guess there was no real reason for this meeting. So I understand your point, and your point is very valid. It is much easier for the boss to say, here's the way I want you to operate, than it is for the individual manager to exercise the prerogative that the boss has given them. I understand that. But my point is that if more people would question, challenge the purpose of a meeting and whether or not I should really attend, I think we'd be much better off and our results would be much better.
You tell an interesting anecdote in the story about the time you spotted a subordinate falsifying expense claims. You weren't sure what to do. You went to your boss and said, what should I do? And he said, let it slide. You weren't happy with that answer, and so you took this to company security. A very courageous thing to do. A lot of managers would not find that wherewithal, and yet you find that this sort of level of accountability is crucial to being a good manager. Can you tell us about that?
The most important thing you can do as a manager is to build the trust in the people who work with you and for you. And part of building trust means that you operate with integrity. And, we overuse the word integrity. We overuse do the right thing. But the real top managers that I have met were as honest as the day is long. They never had an issue with telling people the truth. Here's what it is, here's why it is, here's what we need to do about it. The managers who get into trouble are the ones who are not forthright, who do not tell things like it is, who may fear giving somebody a candid appraisal of what they have done. So one of the goals that I set out early in my career was, this may sound a little bit silly, but I'll just tell you, it was to do the right thing even if no one was looking. Okay, so there's a difference. To me, you can be honest, such as, yes, I took the money from the vault, right? My point goes further than that. And what I think a good manager needs to do is, at all turns, whether anyone is looking or not, they need to be honest. So when I was a mid-level manager at AT&T, it was a very freaky experience because I had people who worked for me that wrote training programs, and they traveled around the country, traveled all over the place. We're always on an airplane. And I had one individual who worked for me who would submit his expense reports, and as the manager, I had to sign them, approve them for payment. And one day I noticed that one of his expense reports looked a lot like one I saw earlier in the week. And I thought, well, I'm accountable for making sure this is correct. I'm sure this is an oversight on his part. I pulled a couple of his expense reports, and come to find out, what he was doing was putting an original, like a receipt from a rental car, and on another later date, putting in a copy of that same receipt and claiming that as appropriate expense. Well, that got me very concerned, and I thought, well, this is not an oversight. This is not something simple. So I pulled all of his expense reports for a period of, I believe it was about 6 months. I looked at them. There were multiple incorrect, lack of honesty in his expense reporting. And I said to my boss, look, some of this happened before I got here. I feel very bad about this. I need to confront this individual. And my boss at the time, a mid-level manager, said, don't. And I said, why? He said, a lot of us travel an extraordinary amount of time and make up for our travel and our time away from our family by picking up a couple of dollars here and there.
So you have now just encountered a cultural issue where your boss is telling you our corporate way of doing things is this.
I wouldn't say it was our corporate way of doing things. It was certainly that division's way of doing things. I like to think it wasn't the corporate way of doing things. Perhaps it was. But in any event, I went home that night. I said to my wife, I've got a problem here. I've got somebody who's stealing from the company, and my boss says it's okay. I went in the next day, and as David pointed out, I called the security organization, and they summoned me to the security office and told them the issue. And for the period of the next several months, they investigated this individual's expense reports. They had a trail of misbehavior that was just unbelievable to me. But my fear was that if they investigated this individual, they would investigate others, including my boss. And I thought there may not be many people left in this department when it's all over, if that was the common way of operating. Long story short, they did investigate other individuals, but didn't find anything of any substance, errors and this kind of thing. But they brought me to the security office after months and said, you have to fire this individual, and this individual has to pay every penny back, or we will press charges. Exactly what we did was we fired the individual. He paid all of the money back. And the day after I fired this individual, my boss congratulated me on doing an excellent job. The department head called me and said, what a wonderful thing you have done. But for a period of many months, I was scared to death. I was going to get fired, and so was everybody else in the department.
How did you get on with your boss after that?
I guess he conveniently forgot that he told me, no, let's forget about this.
That'd be the fifth fundamental, I guess.
Probably the first and most important fundamental of anything is do the right thing, whether anybody is looking or not.
There's another telling anecdote in the book where one of your subordinates wins some highfalutin internal award, the Eagle Award or something like that, and then after the fact, you discover some malfeasance. Can you tell us this story?
There are some good stories in the book, too.
Really,
It's interesting. So I was the president of Bell Atlantic Mobile at the time, and once a year, we hosted the top sales performers in the company at wherever. Sometimes we'd take them to Arizona or, to Hawaii or skiing somewhere. And on one occasion, we recognized the top of the top sales performers, the number one sales performer in the company. And he got the Eagle Award, which was a crystal eagle, and people cheered, and there's a banquet dinner for the individual, and it was just a very fun thing for people in our sales force, and everybody wanted to go on these trips, but only about 100 a year went. Well, so this individual was the top sales performer. We got home after the sales trip, and one of my managers came to me and said, our top sales performer has falsified some of the customer contracts. And I said, well, you mean made a mistake, or what happened here? And We looked at number of contracts that this individual had negotiated with customers and found many of them had a forged signature. The top salesman, top, so to speak, salesperson in the company had actually forged the signatures. The sales VP said to me, forget about it. He's the top sales rep. You can't fire or discipline the top sales rep. The HR vice president said to me, well, let's slap him on the wrist. And I said, let me think about this, because what we do here, undoubtedly everybody will know. And if we accept a cheat, then there will be a common understanding in the company that not just the CEO, but the top officers of the company think it's okay to do this kind of thing. So he was fired.
Maybe one reason I focus so much on these ethical quandaries that come up in the book is because these are the tests of managers that really sort of distinguish the character. It seems as though for a lot of managers, it's easier to go along to get along, and they're not able to make the tough call. One of the big takeaways of your book is to lead by example. Why do so few managers seem to understand that?
I'm not sure. I think it's probably because oftentimes leading by example is difficult to do. I point out in the book that the most valuable tool a manager has in getting results is their own shadow. It was something I learned in a training program years and years ago called the shadow of the leader. And the people who work for you, they may listen to you, they may read what you write, but it's not nearly as important as what you do. And people watch what you, the manager, do, and they will do what you do. For the most part, they want to please you. They want to get the results that you want them to get. And when you show them a positive shadow, they too will adopt that positive shadow and do what you do.
But aren't you saying that being a good manager is essentially being a good parent?
Well, it's probably right. That's probably right. To a certain extent, that's probably exactly right.
Which again raises the next question. There must be a gazillion management books out there, and all of them offer their own guidance. And the takeaway for virtually most of them, and I've read way too many of these things, is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's a very simple rule to apply, and yet there are so many mediocre managers out there. So where is the failure? Is the failure in all of this literature that doesn't quite rise to the challenge, except for your book, of course? Nice save. Or is the failure in the people who, as the Peter Principle would say, rise to these levels of mediocrity and then just sort of gum up the works?
I think that many managers get away from why they are there. They are there to get results. And our first chapter in the book point out 9 reasons managers fail. And just to talk about 2 or 3 of the big ones. Number 1, they focus on the wrong things, okay? 4 fundamentals, I won't repeat that, but they focus on other things and not those fundamentals. The second biggest reason managers fail is they try to make their employees happy. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have happy employees, but the way I think to make employees happiest is to get results, and when results come, employees feel good about their company and good about themselves.
When you get those results, does that mean bonuses?
Well,
I'm an employee. I know I feel good about myself when you give me money.
Certainly, good. Okay, so incentive programs can work. But it's beyond that. I think that employees feel much better about themselves and their company when they know they have gotten good results. Do they get paid for it? Sure. I mean, it helps to pay them accordingly. But it also is just part of being a winning team, and people feel good about that. So many managers assume a position, perhaps the old manager failed, they move into a new position, things are not good. And one of the first things managers, some of them try to do, is befriend the people who work for them. It's important that you treat them fairly. It's important that you build their trust. It's important that you're consistent in how you manage. But making them happy is not the immediate goal. Getting results is the immediate goal, and happiness, hopefully, will follow. The third of 9 reasons, and perhaps the biggest reason, and so many people very clearly understand this because they've worked for individuals like this. There are so many bosses that get so hung up on their position that they forget why they're really there. And think about it. I mean, being a manager at times can be a very heady job, right? It is the managers who travel from coast to coast, who ride in a limousine, who have expense accounts. And too many managers get all hung up on themselves. And one of the keys to success for a manager is to understand it is not about me. This is not me. I am in a role. My role is to get results. And when I leave that role, forget it. It's not about me. And it's been one of my guiding principles for years. Years and years ago, I was appointed as my first president CEO job in the mobile business, Ameritech Mobile, in 1983. And my boss said to me over a long chat in his office, "I'm going to give you a new job. And this is a very important job for this company." He said, "I'm going to tell you something that you won't understand probably for years to come." He said, "The job I'm giving you is the job. You are not the job." He said, "I am putting stripes on your coat. And when you take those stripes off, the stripes are with the job, not with you." And I thought about that for years, and he was exactly right. He was the chairman of the board, and he said, "I sit in the chair. When I leave the chair is still the chair, not me." He said, "Don't ever do things that are in your own self-interest. Never do that first. Always have the shareholder, your customers, and the people who work for you top of mind. It's not about you." It's a lesson that stuck with me for a long time.
That's easily said, but at the same time, virtually all the managers I know who have managed to rise through the ranks have also excelled at being corporate infighters and playing the vicious games that come along with that. You don't really address office politics in this book, but that seems like, it shouldn't be, but it seems like an integral part of a manager's job.
I don't think so. Many may think so. I never played corporate politics. I couldn't have cared less about corporate politics. I avoided corporate politics. I would never say something behind someone's back to get ahead myself. Whenever somebody talked about somebody else or played politics, to be honest with you, I walked out of the room. It made no sense to me. I knew that my job was to get results. Anything that got in the way of getting results, pushed out of the way. And I think that the best managers, those who make it to the top of their corporations, are people that put politics aside. Now, granted, there are some that get there because they have played corporate politics, but I'd suggest to you that for the most part, these are not the best companies in the United States. The best leaders in corporate environments today are those who have been able to push politics aside and get results. So my advice to managers is don't play politics. If you get results, you don't have to play silly little games.
I'll ask one last question, then we're going to get to your questions. After I finished your book and pondered your 4 fundamentals, I thought about, okay, well, what would I want to see from a manager? And I brought it down to 2 fundamentals, but then again, I get at it usually from the customer's point of view. And it seems to me the two fundamentals are make good products and services and treat your customers fairly. Why is that so hard for so many managers?
There's nothing easy about making good products, right? I mean, there are a lot of poor products that are out in the marketplace today. So making good products and delivering the service that goes with them is very difficult to do. And it takes a focus on what customers really want. And it goes right back to how do you grow revenue, keep customers that you have, and get new customers? And the answer is you create good products. If you can't create a good product, you can't do the four fundamentals. I mean, it can't happen. But there are many products that make it to market that are not great products, but people perceive that they are, right? And part of that perception that some companies can create is because they have led people to believe that there is value in the product that they are offering. But most of those products that really don't have the value that consumers need don't last. So a good lasting product is very difficult to come by.
And the other side of treating customers fairly?
The other side of treating customers fairly, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer it, David. It has to be done. I mean, it's just something that in a manager needs to be, it's innate. You have to treat customers fairly. If you don't keep them.
I am in the business of retail credit cards, and I have seen a major change in 10 years ago. We used to capture a lot of landlines. Now it changed to then cell phones. Now 80% of all the numbers that we get are cell phone. And then 2 years ago started changing to not even contract cell phone, now is month to month. So we cannot longer rely on cell phones. In 6 months, we try to reach that customer, verify a purchase or anything, and it's no longer that cell phone. The references, everything, it's gone. Our point of contact with those customers is disappearing very quickly. And it is amazing to me that technology is not really getting us because of the privacy issues with the cell phone industry that are so different from landlines. We cannot do a reverse append or try to locate through cell phone those customers, and it's just really, where are we going on that area?
Do you find that people become more elusive because of wireless? And I mean, I would have thought with number portability that wouldn't be as big an issue as we're hearing there, but apparently there is, especially if you have a Metro PCS contract, for example, you can virtually disappear.
And some of the customers that do have these prepay, they want to disappear, right? So this might be part of the dilemma that you have in credit cards, of course. Where are we going with it? I don't see it changing. And the rules the privacy rules, as you point out, have gotten such that it's very difficult, particularly for companies like yours to track customers. Another piece of the difficulty with wireless customers, of course, is that there is no directory listing for wireless customers. And that has been by design. I mean, many of the wireless companies years ago wanted to have a telephone directory, but the customers essentially did not want it.
I can't imagine why.
Right? I mean, you pay for the calls you send and you receive, unlike your landline, right? So I don't see it changing anytime too soon. I'm sorry.
I work in the toy industry and casting, and this is more of a casting question. In toys, when we cast something, there's a significant 80% of the cost is variable cost, and 20% of the cost is fixed cost. In the telecom industry, I see all the cost is a fixed cost. There's no variable cost. How do you price your plans? When you have your plans like $19.99, $99.99, how do you do the pricing of? You take a fixed cost, and how do you come up with the pricing?
Yeah, you're right, Sam. The wireless costs are largely fixed costs, not entirely, but it might be the opposite of your experience. It's probably 80% fixed costs, I'm guessing, and 20% variable. You do most of the pricing based on your fixed cost and the length of time a customer will be with you. That's why you see a preponderance of, with the exception of the prepaid customer, you see the 2-year contracts. So the pricing that is done is based on an average usage per customer, typically about $60, $70 a month. Some of the PDAs that we use today, like the iPhone or the BlackBerry, are over $100 a month. But it is the average cost, the average price that customers spend per month over the contract period. That's the basis for the pricing in the industry. But there is a huge, huge fixed cost that comes with the cost of wireless spectrum and cellular towers that comes into play. And that's what carriers try to recover over a 2-year period.
Why do wireless carriers break out taxes and fees separately? If I go shopping for shoes, all of the retailers advertise the shoes at the same level, except for the sales tax, which is a given afterwards. I can't comparison shop wireless plans because you all break out these taxes and fees elsewhere to try and get down to this low, low, low number. Why not just a more transparent number that is inclusive of all of these charges?
First, David, to your point, it should be explained when you buy it what the taxes are, and most places, at least the places I'm familiar with, do explain it. But the issue in the wireless industry is that there are so many taxes, some by city, some by county, variable by state, the federal government. There was even a surcharge on cellular phones. So it's complex, but to your point, it should be explained. It should be very transparent when you buy it, and I know that at times it is not.
Excuse me, you were the boss.
Yeah.
So why didn't...
I'm not talking about Verizon here.
Oh, of course not. My bad, excuse me.
No, it varies on the salespeople you deal with, the store you're in, and it is what it is.
The wireless industry, telecom, operates in a very complicated regulatory environment, and I'm wondering what you think the impact on senior managers is, what it would be of a successful net neutrality initiative on your fixed costs, investments, and managers' decisions.
Could you first of all explain what net neutrality is so we all define the terms? Or I could.
I'd prefer that you describe net neutrality because you probably have your own idea.
Actually, I don't. I'm just wondering what the wireless industry is thinking about it and how they're planning for it.
Let me just, net neutrality is an issue a lot of lawmakers and policymakers are facing right now, whereby the gatekeepers of the internet, whether it's Verizon or the cable company or whoever, whether they would have control over the content that's passing over their pipes or whether all content, quote unquote, is created equal. And it's a big issue right now as Netflix and others are starting to stream very data-heavy content out there. Who should be able to call the shots as to what content gets in the fast lane and what doesn't? And so it's a very important issue that does have an impact on ordinary consumers. The telecom industry has been fighting net neutrality tooth and nail, basically saying we have the right to run our networks any way we want. Mr. Strigl.
That's not quite true. It's not a question of running the network any way that you want. Obviously, there are many rules and regulations that attempt to make the service pricing transparent. The issue with net neutrality is one of carriers have a cost, and obviously a large fixed cost, as we talked about a moment ago. The more volume, the more data intensive, the more media intensive a message or a transaction is, the more costly it is to a telephone carrier. So whether you are streaming video or whether you have a basic telephone voice call, they use totally different volumes of spectrum and capacity within a telephone wireless carrier. So net neutrality would argue that it doesn't. Those who are proponents would argue that it shouldn't cost you any more, regardless of what the kind of message is you would like the carrier to transport. There are costs involved, and that's the essence of the argument for the wireless industry is we have costs that we need to recuperate.
So should a Verizon or an AT&T be able to charge a Netflix more for moving its content across the network?
No, it's not. It's not charging Netflix more. It is charging the customer based on the amount of information they use.
And that's not quite net neutrality. That's tiered pricing.
To me, David, it's essentially, it gets at one and the same thing, right? I mean, it all ends up with who assumes the cost, whether it's the consumer, Netflix in this example, or the carrier. The industry would argue it needs to be other than the carrier because their costs are not fixed. They are variable depending on how much information is transmitted.
You had 100 million subscribers at Verizon Wireless. You know a lot of data about each one. You can track every keystroke they do if they get on the internet. It seems to me that being able to monetize that would solve a lot of problems with advertising ROI. Will you ever be able to do this from a regulatory standpoint?
Probably not. From a regulatory standpoint, from a privacy standpoint, I highly doubt it. And it's not been the industry's goal to use the information that the industry has on how you use your wireless service, your home telephone service, or your business service. That's up to you. That's been something that we haven't capitalized on as an industry. I don't see it coming.
I guess my question would be, that means you're going to be able to recoup all of the costs of the data transport by charging for the data transport, tiered pricing or something like that. Will you be able to do that?
Sure. I mean, there's tiered pricing today, right? Some of net neutrality would argue against that, right? But I don't see that changing. By the way, I may be wrong. But I don't see it changing.
Google targets ads at people based on the searches they do. Would a Verizon, for example, be able to target ads at me based on the shows I watch on the Fios service, for example, or the movies I download via Fios?
Is there that capability? Yes, there is, sure. But I don't really feel qualified, David, to comment on whether the industry will or has. In fact, perhaps the industry is already doing that. I don't know. I mean, I've been away from it now for a year and a half or so. I don't know.
And in dog years, that's a long time.
Well, it's certainly in technological years, that's a long time.
Anyone else? Over here.
I travel abroad quite frequently, and even though I have an international roaming deal with my mobile provider, it seems to be disproportionately expensive to use my mobile abroad. Technically, why is that still so? It
is so because of the regulatory environments around the world, in countries around the world. Our daughter is now studying in Florence, Italy. And when I see her wireless bill once a month, it's phenomenal to me. But it is based upon what the country, the regulations that the country have and the pricing that they're able to charge. That is, it is not, if you're a Verizon customer, an AT&T customer, a Sprint customer, it's not what this carrier would like to have happen to you, obviously. But it is the charges that the country is, the operator in that country is charging.
But when I travel, I can use another bank's ATM with a modest fee attached. Why can't I use another carrier's network overseas, again, with only a modest fee attached?
You should be able to. You cannot. But it's not a carrier issue. It is a regulatory issue. I mean, good luck. I don't. I've been part of trying to change some of those rates for years, and you have government-controlled monopolies that it's not going to change anytime quickly, in my opinion.
Denny, a question to you on management. You grew with the company from various smaller companies that merged into larger companies and eventually became Verizon Wireless. Could you walk us through how you merged and managed cultures and people? These different companies probably had very different hiring standards. How they sought talent was very different. How they evaluated them was different. Walk us through some of that.
It's pretty simple. If you are the acquiring company, you have the culture. And I have always, this may sound very dictatorial, if you will, but if I buy you, you're going to adopt my culture or you're going to work somewhere else. Pure and simple, right? So of all the companies that have become Verizon Wireless companies, and there is probably, I can't even count them, probably 20 large companies over the years. We have always worked on the assumption that you would adopt to our style, our culture, our way of operating, and there wasn't much discussion of that. By the way, if there were best practices that you had as a company, we were always very interested in them. From time to time, we would adopt whatever it is, new billing system, new accounting system, because what you had was better. But in terms of the style and culture, you're going to have the acquired company's style and culture, period.
You're a pilot in your spare time. What's the attraction of flying?
The attraction for me over years and years was that if I failed as a manager, I had something else to do.
I take the same approach to journalism. That's the darndest thing.
I was a commercial pilot before I worked for, in the old days, New York Telephone, which is where I started in telecommunications. And I actually walked up and down Main Street in Buffalo, New York on a bet. I was scheduled to go to flight training with an airlines, and a friend of mine said, "You're going to make more money if you become a business person than you ever will as a pilot." So as a bet, prior to going to training in Fort Worth, Texas, I walked up and down Main Street. I put my applications into various businesses, banks, utilities, telephone company. Telephone company made me an offer twice what I would make as a starting pilot. At the time, a starting pilot was $350 a month. But from the time I started, David, I thought, if I don't like this, I've always got something to fall back on. And when I retired, I thought, now I really do want to fall back on flying. But instead, I wrote a book.
You also flew commercial to get here.
I flew commercial to get here, that's right. That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Denny Strigl.
Thank you. Thank you, David.